so attend my children's
Tyler.
stuff as needed.
Very true.
Yeah.
Hi, Tyler.
Hello.
Hi, sorry, I'm just getting in just in the nick of time here.
All righty.
We are just waiting for some copies on the copy machine and one other woman to join us, and then I'll get started. I'd say within about 2 minutes or so. Tyler, have you ever logged into the North Star MLS before?
Yes, I have.
Okay, great. Okay. Have you logged into North Star yet?
So how did you get connected with
I had a friend who was working with them for a year, and she actually just left and went to different brokerage.
Okay.
But she got me connected with Olivia, and then I interviewed with her. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, who did you say you were?
Hoffmeister Homestein.
Okay.
So we're on that side office.
Okay.
But yeah, it's me and then John and Allison, they're married.
Okay.
So we're small, but
Awesome.
yeah, I interviewed with a bunch of brokers and a bunch of teams.
Yeah.
I just felt like they were the best option for me
Yeah.
right now. So
Awesome.
yeah, I'm really excited.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Like yesterday, so like I said, yesterday was my first day. I was like, oh, like it's just like so much. Like the coursework and stuff was like a lot of information. I was like, okay, like just like getting through it.
Who'd you go through?
Cat
Okay.
About
I
you?
kind of wish I went to MCE shop.
one. Okay.
Yeah, it was muscle.
Was it online?
Boring.
Yeah, all online.
Yeah,
So
same.
it's-
Yeah.
I honestly didn't mind it being online because I was in Colorado for a couple months, so
Okay.
so it helped to
I said the computer
Oh,
actually
oh, right here.
you can
it
sit
helped
there,
to
yeah, if you want to get
have it
logged
online
in.
so I could like do it as I could.
Yeah.
The testing for the end of course finals
Yeah.
were just proctored.
Yes.
Yeah. Didn't like it. So did not like that part of it.
Right.
But, like I thought the course finals were harder than the state national exams.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And then I passed the state national. I was like terrified for, because I'm like, I don't know. The last one, I was like, okay, just get through this lesson. But I also hadn't read a test or like taken a test for 15 years. Like actually.
I was just gonna say, it's not fair.
Yeah, I was
You're still in
gonna
study
say,
mode.
yeah,
You're
I-
totally
yeah.
still in study mode.
Yeah.
I may need to have you plug in. I'm not sure how
Okay.
much battery is left,
No, that's
but
fine. Are you a recent grad?
my password is my birthday, which is 0202.
Oh,
Yeah, and then
cool.
Yeah, so.
never thought of real estate, and then I did an internship in Hawaii this fall just for fun.
Oh,
And my mentor out there is a realtor,
Okay.
and so it's like picking his brain. I was like,
Alright.
That's awesome.
Okay, I will get started.
Oh,
Tyler, I'm going to be on camera first, and then I'm going to share my screen with you. Is that okay?
do you have a pin over there?
I do not.
Here,
Okay.
you can
I
have this.
Thank you, Blue,
Would you write
but.
today's date on there, and then also write Tyler Coleman? Thank you, and I'll pass it down to Janae. So, okay, we're getting started a little late. Sorry about that. I like to, as we start this class, I like to introduce myself. And some of you know me already quite well. Tyler, I don't think we know one another, but I'll give a little background. So my name is Melissa Johnson. I know, we've got like 4 go-getters in this class today.
Sure, folks in this room,
I know.
and a genius to
Big
explain
deal.
it.
It's a real big deal. I am also a working mom. I have daughters that are 12 and 8, and I started in real estate like you immediately out of college. I married right out of college, and my husband and his family owned a real estate and construction company though I graduated and figured I'd work at the top of, the IDS tower downtown Minneapolis, wearing a cute little business suit to work every day, my in-laws thought I should do something else. And they said, as you graduate from college, we'd like you to get your real estate license. And to my mom, I complained and said, I do not want to work in real estate. This is not my interest. I don't know what they're thinking. But my very wise and sophisticated mother said, well, it's the family business. Like, if they're going to encourage you to do this, you should at least get your real estate license. You'll be glad that you have it. You'll be glad you have it under your belt, and it'll be easy for you to pass the exams because you're in study mode. So I was like, okay, begrudgingly. And then a few months later, I didn't do anything with my real estate license. I did work downtown Minneapolis. I loved my little life. But a couple months later, my in-laws said to me, it is the spring parade of homes. It's like February, March. We have this parade of homes model down in Belle Plaine, which is like halfway to Mankato. And they said, we really need help on Saturdays throughout the month of February, which you just work in the model home at, for those 4 weekends or 5 weekends or whatever. And again, I called my mom, and my mom was like, come on, hon, just do it. Like, help them out. We need you, obviously. So very begrudgingly, I did it. But I had come from having graduated from college and kind of a corporate, professional, daily life. And so I had a lot of order. I had a lot of organization. I had my CRM all ready to, everything was polished and perfect for this first day that I was in the model. And what I realized after a handful of people came through the model that day inquiring about, what is this town like? What is this community like? What is the process of building like? I realized that it is truly impossible to sell someone a house. They make that decision on their own. This isn't something that we're pushing into, that we're forcing them into. They make the decision 100% on their own. And what they're looking for when they select a realtor is someone that they trust, someone who has good communication, someone who they can go to for guidance. So we're really not salespeople, we're advisors, and we're advising people who want to make a decision, make an even wiser decision. We're helping them do their due diligence, we're preparing all the paperwork so that it's done properly, so that when they make this large investment, that they know that all their T's have been crossed and all their I's have been dotted. So needless to say, I kind of fell in love because the first 2 people who walked through the door that I had fill out little registration cards ended up buying houses from me right away that week. And my eyes were just open to how, what an amazing career could be, how influential it is in someone's life, whether they're buying their first home, they're buying their family a home, they're, selling their home and moving into a retirement condo or something like that. So I was like 22, 23, 24 years old when this was happening. And then I ended up quitting my full-time job and I went into real estate full-time right around September 11th, 2001. And the recession hit. It was very scary in 2006, 7, and 8, but I learned a lot through that process and my career has just evolved. Well, one of the things that I did during the recession was I decided maybe I should also have a family. So we had been married roughly 10 years and our first daughter came along. And although I love kids and I love my family, when it first rocked my world, I was like, I don't know who you are, I don't know how to do this. So I kind of was like, can someone help me? So we hired nannies and I had a ton of help. But then by the time that little baby got to be like 8, 9, 10 years old, I realized I only have a few years left with you. And I know you, but I feel like your whole life has been a blur. I need to do something different in terms of real estate. And Olivia and I actually went to middle school together. And so we had stayed in touch through the years, and 2 times a year or so we'd go out for lunch or go out for a cocktail. And I said to her, like, I don't know if I'm having a midlife crisis or what, but I need to do something different. And she said, well, Keller Williams has this awesome personality assessment called the Qwpr that you can take. And when you take it, maybe you'll learn there's something else that you'd like to do in real estate. Maybe you want to be someone's marketing coordinator. Maybe you want to be a transaction coordinator. I think she kind of knew maybe I would be a good broker here, but I didn't know that until after the fact. So we went through the whole process, and her dad had been the broker here, and he started the business, founded the business, grew the business, but now he's just at a stage in life where he wants to do other things as well. So they were interviewing and looking for a new broker. When I saw that job description, I just said, oh my gosh, it's my dream job. It's absolutely perfect. I had never planned to get my broker's real estate a broker's license prior, because I just really enjoyed working for me, myself, and I, and being responsible for my own day and my own deals and my own transactions. But it has turned out to be just the perfect way to blend what I've done with so many years of experience. It was 20 years of experience when I came here, with what I envision for myself in the future, while also simultaneously having more time at home with my daughters, which is really nice. So you guys will go through all these ebbs and flows and evolutions as well, but that's how I got to where I'm at. I'd just like you guys to know who I am so that you can relate to me, so that you know I am kind of like your big sister here at the brokerage. A lot of people perceive the broker as, you know, someone who's making sure to enforce every rule, and indeed I am, just like your big sister. But when things arise, when you have questions, or more importantly, when you have very serious problems, I need you to come to me right away, not after the fact. I need you to come to me right away, because together, working with the resources that I have as a broker and the experience that I have, we can work through these sort of challenges. So I wear a lot of hats. I fill a lot of roles here at the Market Center. But as the job description was laid out to me, it's just a 25-hour-a-week job. I also do still sell real estate in the evenings and on the weekends, just not as much as I was doing before. But I want you to know, like, genuinely and truly, program me into your phone. Oh, I still need to text you about tomorrow. Program me into your phone, and then call on me. I am here to be a resource to you. Obviously, you'll also be reaching out to HHG, and obviously you to the Hofmeister, so loop them in. And Tyler, you can call and email me anytime. Please don't feel intimidated. One of the hats and roles that I wear here is, it's important for you to become very familiar with the contracts that you will be writing and facilitating on behalf of your clients, whether they're buyers or sellers. And it will take a long time for you to establish the comfortable dialogue that I have, talking through all the contracts and all the paperwork, but with practice and role playing with your colleagues and, you know, with your spouse or with your kids or someone, you will get there. But I do want to tell you one thing before we get into the paperwork. I'm going to be going over this with you quite detailed. Now, not as detailed as some of your clients may want, just in the interest of time, but I'll be going over it very detailed. And I want to forewarn you, do not go over it this detailed with every one of your clients, because rapport will be vanished immediately if you try to talk through something very analytical with someone who's not analytical. So the example that I give to this, and hopefully it will allow you to giggle your way through these next 2 hours, it was like roughly around 2003, 2004, the real estate market was soaring. Everyone was selling a bunch, things were selling fast, life was good, and like we still have to do, we had continuing education classes. So I went to this continuing education class, and the room was about this size. It was full to the brim, and I don't really even remember what the topic of it was, but what I took out of it was this. So the man, the teacher, the presenter, had this goofy, like Einstein type mustache. I mean, and this crazy wiry goofy hair. And so it was really fun to listen to, right? I mean, just like kind of artistic and cool. And he started out and he was kind of pacing around and he said, so how many of you in this room sell just the way you want to be sold to? And literally, I mean, I have elementary schoolers. It was like you were in a first grade classroom. I mean, every realtor, grown adult realtor in that room was like, me, pick me. Of course I do, of course I do. So then he went around the room and he said, well, so how do you like to be sold to and why do you sell that way? And one person would say, you know, oh, this is the biggest decision of their life. They need to know everything about it. They need to know what the efficiency of the windows is. They need to know what the year of the water heater is. They need to know the exact history of every homeowner who's ever lived here. They need to compare the tax amount to the resale amount to the on and on and on. It's such a big decision. It's critical that they know all of that. Then the next person said, you know, like, oh, no one has time for that. No one wants to waste their time hearing about all those details. Like, if they want to buy the house right now, they should just buy it today. I'm not even going to take their name because if they're not buying it today, if they're not able to make that decision, I'm not calling them tomorrow. And people just gave these really strong, elaborate descriptions. And, you know, I'm sitting in the room and I'm kind of like, oh, you know, I don't know. I'm a little bit of a chameleon. I'm not sure even exactly how I want to be sold to. But I listened to everyone in the room. And then the professor, teacher guy in the front said, well, then I'm just going to guarantee to you that you are losing 75% of your sales. Because there's so many different personality types that if you only use your personality in talking with someone else, it's gonna rub them the wrong way. They're not gonna like you. They're gonna go to the model home next door and they will likely work with that realtor instead. And the room just kind of melted. It just kind of was like, oh, yeah, for real. There are so many different personality tests and there's so many different personality profiles. I mean, you know, the Myers-Briggs and all those different acronyms. But the acronym he gave, which has stood with me through all these years, was BOLT. And the acronym is Bulls, Owls, Lambs, and Tigers. So when you guys are, holding an open house, or when you guys have the chance to do a buyer consult, or even when you're on the phone with someone who's called in off the main line, be doing the best job that you possibly can to listen to them and then to kind of adapt to mirror them. Because when he used BOLT as the acronym, it was so easy for me to remember, because the Bulls are that guy who says, if they don't buy today, I'm not calling them back tomorrow, because you just have to be confident in your decision. Well, that's my husband. He makes decisions really quickly, really easy, really confidently. Then there's owls. Owls are more like my dad. My dad does want to know what the miles per gallon are on the car. He will drive an extra 5 minutes to get the gas that's 10 cents cheaper. He does tend to have a million questions and says, like, no way would I buy this today. I need to sleep on it. I need to do my research online, and then I'll come back and buy it tomorrow. Then there's lambs, and lambs are kind of like my little sister who lives in Denver, by the way. She's the one who's like, oh, I don't know, can I afford it? Do I deserve it? I made my decision, but now I'm kind of second guessing my decision. Those lambs are just a little bit more unsure of themselves. And then there's tigers. And some people have called me a tiger, but I think I'm actually kind of more of a hybrid of all of them, because don't forget my dad's an owl. And the tigers are the ones who are like, oh my gosh, look at that gorgeous see-through fireplace. It's like 6 feet long and it's got the coolest rocks in it. Like, oh, I live in this house because I love the fireplace. So I don't know what your personality type is, but when you come upon some of those personality types, you probably cringe a little bit and say like, ooh, that's a lot, or oh my gosh, that person is so slow, they're so annoying. I don't know if I can deal with them. But in any type of sales, in any type of life really, but definitely in real estate sales, you have to put your personality type to the side, keep your confidence, keep your wisdom, but you need to put your personality type aside, and instead you need to adapt to theirs. I take this lengthy amount of time to describe all of that because I want you to know I'm going to be talking through this to you as an owl, and I'm really not an owl. You may have questions, and I want you to ask questions as if you're an owl, because I want you to get a really good gist of the paperwork that we're going through here. But it may bore you, it may drag out today based on your personality type, but just keep in mind, we're going through this as an owl. And like I said, hopefully I can get you to giggle a couple times throughout these next 2 hours when I reference those personality types. So, any questions for me before we get started? Tyler, anything from you?
So did you take an actual test to figure out that you were a tiger, or was it explained how you just explained it and just kind of?
Yeah, now that I think back, that's a really good question. Now that I think back, he probably did have some sort of survey questionnaire that we've been categorized ourselves into. But yeah, it's Bolt, and I could probably even dig up or at least remember his name. So I'll put some thought into that and I'll let you know. But I don't think it was an actual test.
Did you say this was going to be a 2-hour?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have budgeted less?
I think she had me on here for an hour.
That's fine,
but
just getting the beginning will be helpful.
Okay.
And then I do hold this once a month on Tuesdays at 10. And then I also hold another consult session on Saturdays so that those who are, dual career can come in on a Saturday. There's some crossover paperwork between buyers and sellers, but I always do the buyer on one day and the seller on another day. So feel free to come back Saturday if you want to.
Okay, we'll have this, it's a team meeting thing, so I'll have to sneak out for that.
Yeah, that's no problem at all. Yeah, you just pop out whenever you need to.
Okay.
And do you need anything in terms of internet access and stuff to work on Canva or do any of the? Okay, no problem. All right, well, I'm gonna share my screen then and we'll get started. Tyler, any questions from you? Okay, so I do just like to do a little refresher. It sounds like most of you have logged into the North Star MLS before. dashboard, which is great. When you log in and you go right here to the dashboard, you'll notice that there's all of these boxes. They're gray on the top, and that allows you to take that section and move it around. So however you like to look at it, you'll get used to it eventually, and you'll come up with some sort of way that you like to have all of your boxes on your dashboard set up. But we are going to be going to this external link to the Minnesota Association of Realtors forms, which when I started in real estate, there wasn't such a thing. There also wasn't scheduling of showings online either. So there's so much evolution and there's so much improvement. It's a beautiful thing. This is a really, really nice resource. So on the agent dashboard, I always like to go over here to the transactions. And you'll notice as you create transactions, they will log in here. They'll just kind of go in order that you've been working on them. And I happen to see a few other people's here at the Market Center, which is why mine is longer. But we are going to look up Bootcamp. So I just created a transaction to conduct these two classes that I referenced. But as you're going through and working on, and today we're talking about buyers, so as you're going through and working on buyer forms, you'll want to go back into the transaction over and over again so that you can keep all of the forms related to one transaction together in one of these folders. When you click on that transaction, it takes you into a screen that looks like this, which is fine. But my preference for how to look at the screen is by touching over here on forms, because it brings them all up just one in a row. Now, again, you can move these around too. So when you create a transaction, you can move them around in any sort of order that you want to email them as a PDF or send them for a signing or even just talk through with the client. I do want to show you, however, when you're making your own transaction, you would go into whatever listing your client is wanting to make an offer on. This is a listing that I have in Maple Grove. And so if your client was making an offer, you would touch on this kind of green, almost like sunshine starburst looking icon here. And you would click on that and it takes you into where we just were, but it takes you into something called a wizard. And the wizard is really helpful in that you can preset a lot of things so that it auto fills for you and it makes it a lot more efficient. You can put your clients' names right in here and everything. So be sure to use the wizard so that it automatically pulls from an actual listing, but for the purpose of today, we'll just go back into this. So we are going to get started on, literally this is one of my favorite documents. Oops, that one, must have moved it around. This is literally one of my favorite documents. And from a real estate broker's perspective, this is an incredibly important document. Print like 10 of them, keep them in your briefcase, because I have learned in hindsight, though I've known this all along, that you may be questioned at some point. You may be questioned by a compliance board at the Minnesota Association of Realtors. You may be questioned by a fellow realtor. What would you say the first substantive contact was that you had with this client? And technically, at first substantive contact, you need to go over this agency relationships and real estate transactions form. What is beautiful about this and why I say it's one of my favorite things is it says up here in bold letters on the very top, this is for disclosure only, this is not a contract. So whomever you're meeting with is going to be set at ease right here because it's very clear, this is education, this is not a contract. It's 2 pages. They do need to sign it on the front page, and it is your responsibility to go over it. So thinking about bulls, owls, lambs, and tigers, if you're starting to work with someone that you recognize as a full-on owl, you will probably say, let's actually take a few minutes to sit right here before we go out on these showings. I want to go through this whole form with you. If you're working with someone who is a bull, like my husband, you may just say, hey, you know what, throw this in your folder. I just want you to know that it's my obligation to educate you on a few things before we get started on this process. And then as you're walking through the house or as you're driving in the car, you can casually talk through this, but this does have to be presented. So right at the beginning, Minnesota law requires that early in any relationship that the real estate salesperson must discuss with consumers what type of agency relationships they desire, what types of agency relationships exist. So there are 3 things that are listed out here on the front page. One thing that's listed out on the second page And then this, inside this black box, is one of the things that I tend to like to start with. So I'll say, I'm a licensed realtor. I hold my license with the state of Minnesota. Actually, there's a lot of people who have licenses at the state of Minnesota. Even your cosmetologist who cuts your hair has a license at the state of Minnesota. They monitor our license, they make sure that we are compliant, they make sure that we do all of our necessary continuing education to stay on top of things. And in terms of real estate, when we as a licensed realtor work with a consumer like you, we owe you fiduciary responsibilities, things such as loyalty. I will act only in your best interest. Obedience, I will do exactly what you ask of me. This house is listed at 600,000, but if you'd like me to make an offer on it at 550,000, I'm obligated to do that for you. I'm obligated to disclose all material facts that I know about the property you're interested in, yet I'm also obligated to remain confidential in terms of what your motivation to move is, what your price threshold is, what you're pre-approved for, and it is my obligation to use reasonable care to work as quickly and as efficiently as I possibly can. There may be some days that I have prior commitments or a Sunday that I'm spending with my family, but outside of small pockets of time where you have prior obligations, it is our duty to use reasonable care to work swiftly in performing the duties that they need of us. This one is a little outdated in my opinion, but it says that the salesperson will account to client for all clients' money and property that they received as agents. What that means is when they make an offer on a house, they'll put down what's called earnest money. It's a small portion of their down payment, and if they give you a check for their earnest money, you can't like let them fly out the car window or let the dog eat the homework. But we do so much of this now just electronically. We send them a link for them to transfer their earnest money electronically, so this is a little bit dated. Also, something that I think is a little annoying in addition to the accounting is in your real estate classes, you'll learn that this acronym is old car, right? How many times did you hear that in your real estate class? And they don't have it in that order on here, which is kind of a bummer. But it's not a test, unfortunately the words are right out there. This is a little uncomfortable, but it does have to be disclosed and it is going to come up a handful of times. As realtors, we are all-inclusive. We have zero intention of discriminating against anyone, but there is a protected class in the state of Minnesota that may actually play a large role in your decision to make an offer in a certain community, and that is that predatory offenders are a protected class. So I cannot tell you if there's a sexual predator who lives in this neighborhood that you're thinking of making an offer on. It's your responsibility of going to the Department of Corrections website or calling their phone number here. So as a licensed realtor with the fiduciary responsibilities that I owe you, I could represent a seller, and that's called a seller's broker here. And that's what the person is doing who has this house listed. They took the photos, they put the for sale sign in the front yard, they wrote the marketing plan. They are the representative of the seller. They are only going to be representing the seller's best interest. And the opposite is now I'm representing you as the buyer's broker. I don't care what the past history of that seller is. I don't care what the seller's motivation is. It is my sole responsibility to work in your best interest as a buyer's broker. There's also something called dual agency, where the brokerage or myself may represent both the seller and also you as the buyer. Now, as you can imagine, if I'm already representing the seller and I know their motivation, I know the reason they're moving, I know what their mortgage balance is, I know how much they're willing to sell the home for, it may concern you or the seller that I also then have knowledge of you, the buyer. So we need to get authorization from both the buyers and sellers to agree to dual agency, but this isn't about agreeing to it now. This is just about educating you on it, planting the seed. This is something that you'll want to think about as we're looking at houses. Do you agree to a dual agency relationship? And most people do. They just say, it's the house I want, or it's the buyer that I want to sell to. So most people do always agree to dual agency. I had one situation in my entire real estate career where I was representing a seller, and the seller said, no, I do not wish to allow dual agency representation. So that was kind of interesting.
So then what happened?
I just knew that I couldn't represent, or someone from my brokerage couldn't represent the buyer.
Okay.
It worked out where it was a
You
small
still had the
brokerage.
listing and then,
Yeah. Something also worth noting though, like if you were to work at Edina Realty, for example, every realtor in the entire state of Minnesota and Wisconsin who's licensed at Edina Realty becomes a dual agent if it's an Edina listing. However, every office of Keller Williams is independently owned and operated, so we only have the dual agency situation if it's one of the 200 realtors who work here that's listing a house that you have, that you are going to be making an offer. So this form is quick and easy. There wasn't anything that I had to fill in, but when we do get to those forms that have more, I'm going to encourage you, just like you did when you were writing all your papers, save frequently, right? And in this case, we really don't need to. We're just going to go down here to save and exit. There are other features that you can do on here. You can copy this, you can erase it, you can add a watermark, you can remove a page, you can print it, you can email it. But for the purpose of today's class, we'll just be saving and exiting. So when you save and exit, and the reason I like this view is it takes you right back here, and you can say, okay, I just updated the form of agency relationships. All right, that means now I'm on buyer representation contract. I want you to know when it comes to the buyer representation contract that this contract protects you just as much as it protects the buyer. Now, you're not necessarily going to tell them that, but for your purpose and for your sake in knowing how critically important this form is, this is something that protects all the time and energy that you have invested in them, and it assures that you get paid for the work that you've done. So we like to see that the buyer representation contract has an effective date on the top right corner that is the exact same as the start date here, which is going to be the exact same as the date that they sign it. If those dates are different, what's important to know by like legal contract law is that the date that it's actually been signed by them or executed becomes the start date. And the reason that matters to you is, let's just say it's a husband and a wife that are buying this house. And the husband, he golfed yesterday and he ran into this buddy on the golf course, and the buddy said, oh my gosh, I've got all these pocket listings, like, you want to work with me, you got to work with me, I should be the one who should be your realtor because I can get you, the best options. Well, if the wife had already signed this form with you and it was dated, let's just change the date here, let's just say it was dated on June 13th, and she signed it, the start date is June 13th, but he didn't sign it, it doesn't become an executed contract until he does. So it's really, really important to try to have these dates matched up and to try to have them signed all on the same day.
One more question then, back to the
Yeah.
agency form. So since it's not a contract, I get that it's just for representation, so it holds no obligation.
No, there's absolutely
after
zero
this-
obligation for them to work with you. This is where the obligation starts
Okay.
for them to work with you. Yeah, you could have 100 people sign that form,
Yeah.
but you're not representing
just
them
for-
until they
yeah.
sign this form. Yeah. I think it's also valuable to know which forms are kind of inter-office and which forms are critical that go to the title company and the mortgage company, and this form does not. So people can become kind of hyper worried about like, oh, what's their middle name, and are they Joseph or are they Joe? Is it Kathy or is it Catherine? On the buyer representation form, it really doesn't matter. You put in whatever names you know them by here. Try to be as thorough and as professional as possible, but don't sweat over it.
Okay.
So what it goes on to tell you is that there are broker obligations that we as the brokerage and you as our representative owe to them. There's obligations that they owe to us. And then we also go on to talk about payment and such. So scanning through real quickly, we let them know that in signing a buyer representation contract with us at Keller Williams, that we will make a reasonable effort to help them locate a property, that we will use our professional knowledge and skills to help them negotiate on a property, and then we'll assist them throughout the transaction, working in their best interest at all times. Likewise, once the buyer signs this form with us, they are obligated to work exclusively with us. And in this market right now, we're finding a lot of gray in this area where people are like, oh, I didn't really understand, and now I just want to buy my grandma's house. But this is where it protects you. The buyer is obligated to work with you and pay you once they close on a house. So a little confusing, and therefore I tend to save talking through this paragraph for a little bit later, but a little bit confusing. They have to understand that by signing this agreement, they are obligated to pay us whatever percentage of the sales price of a property, plus what's called a broker administrative fee of $499, it's additional commission, when they close on this purchase. Now, what we do is most properties that you're going to be making an offer on are listed on the North Star MLS. It will list down here that there is a buyer broker compensation of our industry standard is 2.7. Keller Williams doesn't allow you to list for anything less without written approval from me. And so we have a form called a compensation disclosure, which I'll get to next, and you may even want to bring out for those buyers. This compensation disclosure lays out very clearly that the 2.7 is actually coming from the seller, it's not coming from them. So though they are obligated to pay it, it can be covered by a cooperating real estate brokerage. And it goes on to talk about how that if the buyer purchases or agrees to purchase a property before the expiration of this contract, even if they don't work with us as a broker, they're obligated, if they work with someone else, they're obligated to pay us the 2.7. And furthermore, if they buy a property that we show to them during the time of this contract, that they don't make an offer on during the time of the contract, that they go back to that selling party, and it says not to exceed up to 6 months, that they still too are obligated to pay us. Now, I'll be honest with you, in my 22 years of experience, I've never ever had someone had to utilize this clause and go to someone kind of in a confrontational way and say, well, I saw that you bought that house that I showed you and now you owe me, $8,000 or whatever the case may be. But this does give you the teeth to be able to protect you to do so should the circumstances be necessary. Probably won't be, but this is a real protection for you here. When talking about this 2.7%, it's always a good idea to get your pen out and to show them the broker is authorized to negotiate and receive compensation paid for by the seller or the brokerage representing the seller, and that we must inform them in writing at the time that they're signing a purchase agreement if there is cooperation there. So this is very confusing to people, like why if I'm obligated to pay for it and it says here that the seller can pay for it, what really do I owe? It can be very confusing. So to those owls, do your best to be detailed. To everyone else, you're going to be scanning through here pretty quick and just say, I need to disclose to you that I do make a commission on this, my brokerage takes a portion of it, my team takes a portion of it, I make the balance of it, and I pay my taxes after that. It's roughly 2.7% on average, is how I kind of talk through it for the rules. All right, further talking about that compensation and this big caution line in here, then we go in to talk about the general nature of this property that they're making an offer on. Is it for personal use? Is it vacant land? Is it an investment property? We here at Keller Williams Preferred Realty, we always recommend that you check every single box. Now, I'll be honest, in auditing files, most of the time I just see this check mark come through, that it's for residential personal, or maybe it's for an investment property. But I tease and say the way they taught me when I started here as the broker was that you just never know. Like, what if your client that you have your buyer representation contract with the Powerball? What if, right? They may buy some investment properties, they might buy a farm, they may buy some land. You want to make sure that you've covered all your bases. So you check all those boxes just so that there isn't any question and there isn't any gray area. Do what you wish, no big deal if you just check the personal, but I recommend checking all the boxes. Oftentimes, buyers will make presumptions about you as a realtor and you having knowledge when it comes to a wide variety of things. Now, we do have knowledge and we do have a lot of resources, but we are not authorized to practice law. We are not authorized to do things like be an expert in terms of house engineering. We can't be an expert even in knowing about home inspections. We will refer them to all of these types of professionals. Likewise, we will refer them to a qualified closing agent to do all the final paperwork, placing them into title at closing. So this is missed a lot, but there's a little initial right here that says either the buyer directs the brokerage arrange for a qualified closing agent, or the buyer shall arrange for that on their own. If you check that the buyer shall arrange for that on their own, essentially, you don't have permission to share their purchase agreement with anyone. They're not allowing you to share the purchase agreement with anyone. So you really want them to check line 66 if at all possible. But I do find when I get to this part right here, every now and then, if it's a couple, the husband and wife will look at one another and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot. Great Aunt Susie told me she's the title closer. If I was ever gonna buy my first house, then I needed to close with her. And so it's good that we're asking in this paperwork, because then those types of things come out, like their intentions come out. So you do have to ask them, they do have to check it, and they do have to initial it. You're letting them know that in addition to the commission that they're paying Keller Williams Preferred Realty, in addition to the $4.99 broker administrative fee, there may be some other costs that they have to pay, which can increase the amount of cash that they bring to closing. Those are things like their closing costs. Okay, kind of like talking about the sexual predators. This is also a little tricky to talk through. So again, for the owls, you can be very thorough. For everyone else, you're probably gonna wanna breeze over it. But it's incredibly important for your buyers to know and understand this. If the seller of their home is not a US citizen, let me get the terms here correctly, because you can have a bunch of different sort of identifications, but if the seller is a foreign person, so that's the best way to describe it. If they are a foreign person and they fail to comply, meaning they don't pay their appropriate taxes on the sale of the home that your client is buying, and they leave the country, nowhere to be found, who has to pay those taxes? Your buyer. It's scary, it's really scary. So we can't make assumptions that sellers that we're working with are not foreign individuals. We have to make sure that they are the ones who disclose that at every check mark that we come along here. So you'll hear me talk about FIRPTA at other points, but in most instances, the seller is not going to be a foreign individual, foreign person, and in most cases, you're not gonna have to take the time to talk about this. But if you're working with an accountant or an engineer or someone who's really analytical and will say, why did you skip that whole section? I want you to be educated on exactly what this means. Likewise, in terms of additional costs, and if I could revise some of these forms, I would, but likewise, in terms of additional costs and having to pay these taxes, if the seller is a foreign individual and it's not already paid, the buyer may also choose to conduct a home inspection on the house as a contingency prior to agreeing to buy it. And they may also elect to have a home warranty on the property. Those would be elective costs, and those they have to pay for out of pocket as well. It's not included in the real estate commission. So as you know, because we talked about it when we went over the agency relationships and real estate form, there is a possibility that a house that you make an offer on is going to be listed by myself or Keller Williams Preferred Realty, and you have the choice at this point now to decide. Either you will agree to allow dual agency representation and consider properties listed by our brokerage, or you won't. And they'll check yes or no here, and they will, yeah, no problem. And they'll sign here, and you also have to sign here. Whether they do or do not, you'll always sign there. The next couple lines you're going to find are, they're really just like definitions and explanations. So depending on the personality type of your buyer, you're either going to go through it in detail, or you're going to say, yep, feel free to read through these next few clauses. These are just definitions and explanations. Now we're at the point here where I'm going to ask you to sign this, and I'm going to be signing it as well. But for the owls, we need to let them know that it is a possibility that I have other clients, or that my brokerage has other clients that are also seeking to make an offer on this home that you're making an offer on right now. It's really important that you understand I have an agency relationship with you from the time that you sign this contract, and from the time that we dated this contract until the closing of a property. So there's a possibility that I've also had previous agency relationships with the seller of any of the homes that you're going to be looking at, or with other buyers who may be interested in the property. We can cancel this contract, which means that we would terminate my fiduciary responsibilities, and it terminates at successful closing, or if we write up a cancellation to this contract, whichever occurs first. As we talked about on the agency relationship disclosure, I am not allowed to discriminate against anyone, and regarding state statute 243.166, it is your obligation to check with the Department of Corrections website or call Qwpr. This entire agreement doesn't become an agreement until it is signed by both parties, so it has to be signed by them and also by you. and it can be modified and canceled, but it can only be done in writing. Anytime I send you a citing for electronic signatures, those electronic signatures are just as valid and binding as a signature that we may do in ink. And also, buyer authorizes broker and all of its representatives to contact you by the contact information that you leave below. And that means we can fax you, we can email you, we can text you, even if it might cost them extra additional funds. There's another section in here, and these forms get revised every summer, so by the time you guys go to use these, you'll probably see a little different version of it. And one of the things that is sometimes dropped off is the disclosure of this $4.99 brokerage administrative fee. So if you see that it's not on your form, or if it's not on your computer when you're filling out this form, you are still responsible for disclosing that, and you would do so by writing these words. Buyer understands a one-time brokerage commission of $4.99 shall be paid as a part of closing costs upon successful closing. Other things that you might write in here would be things like, should Joe and Sally decide to buy the home at 123 Main Street from their grandmother, my representation contract does not apply. So there may be like special circumstances or things that they say, I've been working with my neighbor about possibly buying his house, which is why I'm not looking at other options with you. I need to decide if I really want that, but if I decide to buy it from the neighbor, we've already talked about price, we've already done the terms. I do want to also show something right here. When you get to these larger boxes and you click on them, you can go to this little green plus sign that says add clause, and you can create a bunch of clauses for yourself and save them in personal clauses. So copy and pasting this and taking the time to create it as a personal clause for yourself is a good idea. There's also going to be little things that come into play more when it comes to so I have it already in here, BAC. There are also maybe other things that come up, such as, we agree to pay this house for full contract sales price, even if the appraised value is not found to be the same as the contract sales price. We are waiving our home inspection. There's just a variety of little clauses that you may find you get in the habit of writing with all of your clients, or you get in the habit of writing with one specific client. This person that you're working with may have a severe mold allergy. So maybe one of the clauses you write in every purchase agreement is that this is also contingent upon having a XYZ, whatever type of home inspection. And rather than feeling nervous and panicked as you're writing their offer, like, oh, am I gonna get the terminology right this time? You can just save it as an additional clause. Now, I'm asking a favor of you, though I don't see this very often when I'm auditing files. I'm asking a favor of you to write in their home address, their phone number, and their email address on here. You'll already have that, so it is kind of annoying to have to repeat it a few times on these forms, but it's really important from the Market Center because if sadly you are in an unexpected car accident, or if you got sick for some reason, or you're off the grid because you're camping in Colorado or something like that, we want to make sure and have some contact information for them, and this is a good spot to do it. We also need to have all buyers sign this wire fraud acknowledgement. Sadly, as every day the internet evolves, and cybersecurity, there are a lot of possible cyber hackers and a lot of deceitful things that can be done. So when it comes to the day of closing and the buyer is putting 5% down and they're putting, call it $30,000 down or something like that, they will likely wire from their bank to the title company their funds for down payment. But if it is interrupted by some sort of cyber criminal, they would just lose that money altogether. So we need to just educate them and let them know we're going to give them very specific instructions. The title company is going to give them very specific instructions. Don't follow anyone else's instructions. And we just need to be aware that that sadly exists. We then go on to what are called the Qwpr additional disclosures. So when I started at Keller Williams, this was one of the forms that I was most excited about because these are things that really should be written in the purchase agreement, but they're not by the state. And so Keller Williams has just gone the extra mile to say, these are some additional things we want you as a buyer to be educated on and to be thinking about. We need you to understand that every time you make an offer on a property, that the seller is going to provide to you a seller's disclosure statement. You can make an offer without having read the seller's disclosure statement, but it really is wise and in your best interest to review that before making your offer. It's also a high probability that you are going to be contingent, your purchase is going to be contingent upon you conducting a home inspection. And there are various types of people and entities that can perform home inspections on your behalf. We can give you recommendations, but we're going to have you hire them and pay for them on your own. There's also a possibility that you may ask to have a warranty included in your purchase. The buyer and seller can negotiate who's going to order that, who's going to select it, who's going to pay for it, but there may be deductibles and things that impact your coverage. It's also a high probability that the offers that we make are going to be made in simultaneously with other offers, which is called a multiple offer situation. And it's really important for you as the buyer to understand, and so please initial here, that it is the seller's choice 100% to divulge whether there is or is not the existence of another offer. They would likely never ever tell us any of the terms of that other offer, but you're going to be begging me as your buyer's agent for more information, and I can only give you the information that the seller passes on. It's also important to know that the home that you're purchasing may be a part of a community association. Now, use logic and say a condo is going to have an association, a townhome is going to have an association, but you also need to keep in mind there are quite a few single-family homes in communities that have a shared pool. Maybe they even just own the park bench, you know, at the far south end where people can go and sit and watch the birds. Or maybe they own that monument when you drive in and it says, you know, The Point or Timber Ridge or whatever the name of the neighborhood is. If the home that you're offering does fall within a community association, you by state statute have 10 days to review those association documents, the budget, the rules, the regulations, all the history. But there may be some expenses related to that, and your expense to live in the neighborhood, as we have it advertised on North Star MLS, we tell them what their association fee is embedded within here, but that doesn't mean it's always going to stay that way. It can potentially increase. There's information here on tax deferred exchanges, which are also called 1031 exchanges. You'll see IRS code 1031 in here and here. I wish this was formatted a little differently, and I've been pushing for that too. This should be easier to change since it's a Keller Williams doc. But if you are not working with someone who is doing a tax deferred exchange and they would make that crystal clear to you as a buyer, just skip over these sections because it's way too much to talk about. I'll talk about it at the seller bootcamp because that's where it comes more into place. As I mentioned to you before, we are experts and highly trained in the field of real estate and marketing properties, but we cannot be expected to be experts in things like building inspections, tax advice, appraisal, tax value, legal advice, environmental issues, and it's really helpful to have this laid out right here because if they have a need for these professional services, of course, we're pleased to provide you with a list of providers who have served many of our clients in the past, and of course, you can seek your own recommendations as well. Kind of a couple little goofy things here. It is required by Minnesota state statute that every single family dwelling have a carbon monoxide alarm installed within 10 feet of each room. So we as a buyer are going to insist that the sellers put those in place for us. And if you're representing a seller, you need to be watching for that at your pre-listing appointments and make sure and point it out and have them added. Now these two are kind of my favorite because this is going to happen to you, sad but true, inevitably. We set a closing date. We hope that the closing date goes off without a hitch, but there are a lot of moving parts, and it is certainly feasible and possible that a closing date may need to get pushed out, delayed, changed for some reason. There may be unforeseen circumstances, as it says here. And we are sorry, but we're forewarning you ahead of time. So when you have someone irate on the phone who says, I ordered pizza for all my friends, I've already paid $1,000 to the moving truck, what do you mean my house isn't closing today? You can always say, bring it forward to them and say, it was all of our hope that you would close today, but I did forewarn you this is a possibility. Likewise, the date of closing or the day before, you're going to go to the property to conduct what's called a final walkthrough. You go there to be sure that before they sign on the dotted line, that the house is indeed in the same substantive contact as it, same substantive condition as it was at the time that they made their offer. So it's important that they carve out the time for that. They're going to be really busy, they're going to be packing up, they're going to be picking up their check for closing. If for some reason they decide not to do it, we will have them sign some sort of walkthrough waiver. And I don't have that here in these forms. It even just be some sort of electronic communication where the buyer says, I agree to waive my walkthrough. As long as you have it from them and in writing, that's good. We use the same form for both buyers and sellers. So in the case of the workshop today, you'll have the buyer sign and date over here, write their name below. Ideally, you would write in the property address of the property they're making an offer on, and then also write your name. But I'm okay if you leave the property address off here. I recognize you're gonna have to make a handful of offers before landing on one, and so you can just leave the property blank. Now, if any of you have ever bought a brand new car, when you sat down to sign all of your forms, they have likely said to you, we need to disclose, not only do we own Ford Motor Company, but we also own Ford Motor Credit, we own Ford Finance, we own Ford Warranty, and it is just a requirement by the federal government that anytime one person has ownership in multiple different businesses, the consumer is potentially going to be using any of those businesses, it has to be disclosed. So of the pool of owners who own Keller Williams Preferred Realty, one or some of them may also have ownership in Minnesota Title, New American Funding, Keller Mortgage. You are not obligated in any way, shape, or form to use any of those services. Those are just there for you as a convenience. They put some estimates here of what costs are should they choose to use them. And then again, it's underlined. We understand that we have the right to select our own providers, that we strongly encourage them to shop for the best service and rates possible. So this isn't committing or agreeing to anything. This is just acknowledging that we let them know, should they use those, we have shared ownership in all of them. Now, when you go to make an offer on a property, this is when you're going to use the compensation disclosure, which makes it very, very clear to the buyer that I'm offering on this property, 123 Main Street, and that the 2.7% that I owe to Keller Williams is actually coming from the seller. But the $4.99 broker administrative fee is coming from me, and I'll be paying that as part of the closing costs. We give as a gift to veterans, we waive their broker administrative fee. So if you have, for some reason, an arrangement with a buyer, and they aren't going to be paying the $4.99, I don't want you to just leave it here as blank because that's too gray and I don't understand what your arrangement is. But if you have an arrangement, or if it's a VA, you would write in 0 here, or you would say something like, to be paid for by buyer's agent. So just try to make it as detailed and clear here as possible for my sake and for records at the Market Center. Otherwise, in most cases, they're paying the $4.99. It's just one of the various fees that they pay at closing. Again, you sign it, they sign it. This also asks for their address and their email address, but doesn't ask for their phone number. Go figure. I have no. Okay, I'm going to come to one last thing, and then I'll let you get to your meeting.
Okay.
I want you to know that when showing houses, print a bunch of these, keep them in your briefcase as well, and highly, 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 highly recommend that you bring with you a personal property agreement. Because you'll find on the purchase agreement, there's a lot of things listed out like garden bulbs and the drapes and the refrigerator and whatnot, but there's so many cute decorator shelves. There's so many cute little pieces of artwork that sort of look like maybe they're a part of the house. But the last thing that you want is to come to that final walkthrough with your buyer and then to start crying, saying like, oh my gosh, I was gonna put my doll collection on that shelf on that wall. Like it's a family heirloom and I can't believe they're gone and now the wall is all ripped up. And you're gonna be like, oh shoot, I forgot to write that in, that was going to be included. So this is just a safety checkpoint for yourself. You're gonna write in everything and anything that they want there. Basement, freezer, garage door openers, be really, really thorough and detailed. Cool?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for stopping in.
Thank you.
Do you know where they meet at 11?
No,
Where to find
so
them?
they must be upstairs.
They do go upstairs.
Okay.
Yeah, you may even just want to take the back hallway and see if anyone's still
Okay.
working their way up there.
Okay, when is your next one of these? This was like so helpful. I just love going over these.
Good, yeah, I will show you this, actually, Qwpr dashboard.
Okay.
And on the Qwpr dashboard, you can go down here to the bottom, there's a lot of resources on it,
Okay.
which is really, really good. You can go down here to the bottom and there are YouTube links of every single one of those forms individually. So you can listen to me anytime, anywhere. But my next one will be in July, and then I'm also doing one for sellers on Saturday at 10 a.m.
Okay,
If you want to come on Saturday, but no one really likes to do that for the seller.
I actually would, but I will be in Duluth, but
Oh,
I
good for
appreciate
you.
this, I'm glad I made it for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad you did too.
Thank you.
Yes, I appreciate it.
Yes.
Tyler, any questions from you? Okay,
Not at this point.
okay, hopefully you're not too bored.
I have a question. I think I actually will be able to come on Saturday to the seller's
All
one.
right.
Yeah, so I'll be 9 a.m. Denver time. Do I have to tell you that I'm coming?
No, do you know how to access the links?
Is it
Zoom
on the
links?
dashboard?
Yeah, it's on the dashboard. Well done. Dashboard. So all the links to all the Zoom meetings, and this is called I think it's called PC. Somewhere down here. Wait a second. I know it's on here. Links to, oh, I think it's because it's up here. It's links to.
Zach, I need to get the camera working.
Yeah, no problem. Darn it, it's on here somewhere. It's this.
Is it in,
How strange. Oh wait, is it down here further? Looking for a Zoom link. There we go. So scroll all the way down. It's at the very, very bottom, and then you'll go on to PC group coaching.
okay, PC coaching.
Good. Oh, good. I'm glad you're able to make the time for that. Sweet. Do you need to step out and use the restroom or anything?
Nope.
Brush your coffee or?
Okay, actually, I'll run the bathroom if she's.
Yeah, go
Is
for it.
it
That'll give
just-
me a minute to check my
Is
email
it,
too.
oh,
It's probably best to go past the front desk and then out to the bathroom.
okay.
Are you finding this interesting?
Yeah, I am.
Good.
Yeah,
Hey Sarah, it's Melissa. I'm in the middle of a bootcamp, so it's just a little easier for me to call you than text you. So, you can share that information at any time with the seller's permission. So cover your bases and make sure that the seller gives permission. You really can do that anytime. It just may not be in the best interest of your seller, because if the contract that they have falls through, they're going to want everyone to be curious about, what the sales price is. And so if you've revealed that, it just removes some negotiating power. But yes, as long as you have permission from the seller to share that, I'm cool with it too. I hope it helps out other KW agent that probably do this, but they just wanting to get some advance info. And as long as it's pretty close to closing, I think it should be just fine. All right, talk to you. Bye. I'm sorry, what was your question?
Yeah, because like when we're putting in listings into the command, like this is what I see, and I was just also confused. So this is kind of
Yes.
helpful to just know,
Good.
because like we're supposed to just look at like the signatures, making sure it's signed and everything, but I still just want to know like what the
What are they nice?
Yeah.
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 Well, I know you are like grad party central, but if you wanna come here or even listen in on the Zoom on Saturday from 10 to noon,
Yeah.
it might be helpful for you.
Yeah. I think I can do that.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I should probably introduce you two, by the way. I kind of rushed through that.
I'm Johnny, and nice to meet you. I think I did like say hi to you in the front. but-
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Janae has kind of a fun path to Keller Williams. She was a part of well, actually, you both went to Prior Lake High School.
Yeah.
She just graduated from
I just
Prior Lake.
graduated.
And she was in the MinCaps program. Did you ever do MinCaps?
Mm-mm.
Did you hear it though?
Mm-hmm.
So she did MinCaps and Keller Williams was her project.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we saw her and we were like, oh my gosh, you are perfect for this. And she wants a career in real estate.
Yeah.
Oh my
So
gosh.
we snapped her up to work at the front desk. We're snapping her up to do some social media.
Wow, that's amazing.
I know, she's already starting to take her classes.
I know. I just finished two modules.
She did.
Yeah.
Oh,
So now
she
I'm
should
gonna start.
go. So you just graduated like this last Friday?
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, wow, congrats.
Thank you.
Isn't that amazing? Okay, I am gonna go on then. After the form that we just went through, which is the personal property agreement, do you guys have in your packet the next form for your protection and home inspection? Or did I skip over that?
You already did the purchase agreement?
Not yet.
Oh, yeah, for your protection.
Okay, cool. So, many people right now are waiving their home inspections, which I think is a very, very, very bad idea. Now, granted, some people just have to do it to be in the running to get a house, so that's fine. This is a form that's put out not by the Minnesota Association of Realtors, which all the other forms are. This is put out by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's something that they require people sign if they're doing FHA or VA financing. It's not a requirement for anyone else, but it's a form that exists and I think you should just use it. So if for some reason someone says, no need, I don't need to do a home inspection, make sure that they've signed here because it says here that we've read this document. We understand if we wish to get a home inspection, it's best to do so. It describes how the appraisal is different than the home inspection and that we make a voluntary choice whether to do this. It doesn't have anything to do with the realtor. So it's kind of like covering your liability. And it's just a really good form to have in the file. It's not something that I require for auditing. It's likely not something that the mortgage company will require. If they're telling you they're willing to skip a home inspection, have them sign that form. So let's go into the PA. This is a really, really long document. This is one where they do have to have their proper legal names. It's helpful even to have like middle initials or middle names. This document is used as a contract, a framework of the agreement between the buyer and seller, but it's also used by the mortgage company to put together their loan, and it's used by the title company. So no pressure, but a ton of industry professionals are going to be seeing this, including me, your broker, but I see all these forms. So when you're making an offer on a house, you're going to want to write on here the date that you're making the offer, put in the buyer's legal names, and then I usually skip over this earnest money amount as I'm talking through it with them, and I say, we are making an offer here on 123 Main Street. It's in Prior Lake, Minnesota in Scott County. It's the zip code of 55372, and the legal description of, and you find that on the MLS listing here. It's more embedded in here is the legal description. That they'll need for the title purposes. So I talked about that list of personal property. This is a list that the Minnesota Association of Realtors has included as personal property so that there aren't any questions. Things like the doorbell has to stay, thermostat has to stay, all ceiling speakers and mounts, the carpeting, the mirrors, the garage door openers. But you know what? Attached mirror. Is that round decorative mirror or that super cool thick framed floor to ceiling mirror that's in the mudroom? Are those attached mirrors? I don't know. They're just hanging on a hook. I don't know. They're just leaning up against the wall. So there are some gray areas, which is why I say it's really, really important to write down that personal property when you're in the house and your buyer is telling you what they want to have. There can be other things that you list here as personal property. So if it's, you've really written nothing on that personal property agreement and you can just fill it in one line here, they want the balance in the baby nursery or whatever, there may be some things that they don't want included in the purchase. Like if there's an old rickety trampoline from, 1995 back there that's all rusted out and your client wants to make sure that the seller disposes of it so they don't have to tackle it. Or if there's an old heater in the garage that they're not using anymore, there can certainly be some things that you write here on line 36 are excluded from the purchase agreement. I'll also call your attention to MLS listings. You'll notice, of course, that there are always public remarks, and this is what people see on Zillow and such, but then we have the chance to enter an agent remarks here. And prior to going to all showings, you should absolutely read those agent remarks because some of those things might be noted there, like seller is taking the cool metal shelves with them, those to be excluded. And then to just show your detailed thoroughness and professionalism, write that in here so that it's crystal clear. We're letting them know that we're making an offer on this condo for $200,000, and of that, 5% minimum is going to be their down payment, which means they're financing 95% of it. Now, people will often say to me, gosh, I think I might be able to put down 5 to 10% because this is a framework of the agreement with the seller. Don't write in 10% in hopes that you can meet 10%. Write in 5% because that you can guarantee to do. If you choose to increase your down payment, that makes you just even a stronger buyer and borrower. But these numbers are meant to be a bare minimum of what they're going to be putting down and also what they're going to be financing. It is very rare that the buyer would assume the seller's current mortgage. Not all mortgages are assumable. It's also very rare that the buyer will need a contract for deed financing. And so these two, numbers 3 and 4, are going to be left blank 99.9% of the time. I want to call to your attention that of this 5% of the sales price that the buyer is putting down, it includes their earnest money. So then I go back up to the top and I say, it's industry standard that a small portion of your down payment is going to be given to the seller as a sign of your dedication to this, of your loyalty to this, of your seriousness of this. So you can put any amount down as earnest money that you wish. It's a check that you write to the real estate company representing the seller, or there's also electronic transfer that I can send you and you can utilize. There's a small fee for it, but I can send you something called a Fiduciary, or you can write the check, but it's completely up to you how much earnest money you want to provide. It's industry standard that it's usually 1% of the sales price. It can be as high as you want. Just know it comes out of your control, it goes into the control of the listing real estate brokerage. It doesn't go directly to the seller. And then it will be a portion of this down payment that you'll need to bring with you to closing. Does 1% sound okay to you? $2,000? Yeah, that sounds great to us. Or some people will say, gosh, I have a lot more. I want to show them I'm more serious. I can give you 4,000. I can give you 10,000. But it's completely up to the buyer. Just know minimum is usually 1%. We talked about how closing dates are a goal, but they can be a moving target. So I'm just going to pull up a calendar here, and I'm just going to give you guys kind of a little pro tip, food for thought. I avoid closing on Mondays at all costs. Fridays are really, really, really busy, so I also kind of try to avoid those, but naturally people tend to want to close on Friday to give themselves 2 days off on the weekend, so they don't have to take extra work time off. The reason that I skip Mondays is because title companies are just slammed and swamped on Fridays, and so sometimes they're not real on point. First thing Monday morning, closing on like a Monday afternoon might be okay, but in my opinion, the best days of the week for closing are Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Also know that due to a mortgage interest little kind of thing, a lot of people will try to close on the last day of the month. The problem with that, though, is these title companies and also realtors tend to be spread very thin and very, very hectic and very, very busy. So I try to avoid the last week of the month if at all possible as well. Little tips. And then, of course, it all really comes down to when the buyer wants to close. But it is, if you're making an offer today on June, let's just call it 15th, it would be very challenging for your mortgage company to get the loan prepared by July 15th. So it's best to give your buyers roughly 45 days for them to be able to do all the things necessary to prepare their home to be able to close in time. So 45 days out is kind of an average. Going 2 months out, you can surely do as well, but then sometimes you worry, like, is this too far out? Like, what if they get cold feet? What if they lose their job? What if they get in a car accident? So closing as soon as possible is a good idea. 45 days, this should be kind of your target. So now we are preparing this as the buyer, and all this information is going to be presented to the seller. We're letting the seller know that this purchase agreement is contingent upon the buyer obtaining mortgage financing, that they're going to be taking out a first mortgage, and either it does or does not include some sort of grant or bond or loan assistance program. If it does, you would write that in there. There's an acronym called MHFA or something like that, that gives first-time home buyers a little money towards their down payment. So that would be the most common thing that you would write in there. However, most people do not use a grant program. Most people do a first mortgage. Some people may do a first mortgage and subordinate financing. What that means is putting 20% down on your loan is the best way to do it so that you have the lowest monthly payment, so that you don't have to incur something called private mortgage insurance. So some people may say like, oh, I've saved up like 15%, maybe 18%, but I just am not going to be able to get to that 20% by closing. The mortgage company may say, oh, no problem. We'll just take a 10% loan. We'll put that in as cash for your down payment, and that would be what's called subordinate financing, because they'd have the whole mortgage and then they have the second mortgage payment. Again, you have to be very transparent, because if you don't put that 5% down that we outlined on the first page, if you do use a grant program, you are then outside the terms of the contract. So you're going to want to try to be as accurate and thorough as you possibly can going in. Sometimes you're making these offers in kind of a rushed fashion, but you do want to try to have your ducks in a row and talk with your mortgage company before an actual offer is made. So we also need to let the sellers know this is going to be a conventional loan. Maybe it's going to be a VA loan. Maybe it's a FHA, first-time homebuyer loan. If they're buying in some outstate Minnesota areas, they can buy with 0 down and what's called a USDA rural loan. But these are the two that you'll be using most commonly, either the conventional loan or the FHA loan. Now we are in a time where we are having rising interest rates. You've probably heard this. Interest rates and gas prices are rising. So we need to let the seller know, and this is a protection to your buyer right here on line 66. It's a very important protection to your buyer, that they're applying for a mortgage. It's going to be amortized over 30 years. So the mortgage is paid off in 30 years. There are some loans that are paid off in 15 years or in 10 years, but it's most often a 30-year mortgage. And then we need to let the seller know that it's going to have an interest rate of no more than. This is a protection to your buyer, because if the monthly payment no longer becomes affordable to them at 6% or at 6.5%, they would not be contractually obligated to buy the home if it did so. So this is you protecting the buyer. It then says, though, that the mortgage application does need to be made within 5 business days of final acceptance of this purchase agreement. And it goes on later to talk about whether the buyer can lock in on their interest rate at any time or lock it in right away. So we'll get to that in a second here. There are 2 options in terms of mortgage financing contingency removal. So we're going to let the seller know that we agree to remove our mortgage financing contingency anytime leading up to closing, which would be checking box number 72, or anytime up to a certain date. Then after this certain date, the mortgage company needs to provide what's called a witness statement, verifying that all the work has been done on the loan, the appraisal's been done, all the verifications of income, all the verification of assets, and that after this date, that the earnest money then becomes non-refundable. So as you can imagine, this is a little bit riskier for your buyers. This is a little bit safer for your buyers, but the problem is the sellers aren't going to see it probably as strong. We are going to let them know then that if they cancel the purchase agreement based on their mortgage financing, that either the money comes back to the buyer, which is the strongest for them, or we agree to forfeit it to the seller because we didn't essentially hold up our end of the bargain. We couldn't get the loan in time, and so we forfeit it to the seller. So you're gonna wanna be writing this to benefit the best interest of your buyer, but you're going to have to take some calculated risk here and doing some things that also benefit the seller in order for your offer to be enticing enough for them to accept. So this goes on to talk about the definition of the written statement. Now, I'm gonna tell you, since I'm about 100 lines into it, I strongly encourage you to be saving this frequently because you're putting in a lot of work and I don't want it to be lost if your battery runs out, for example. We also then talk about, as I referenced before, about the locking in of their mortgage interest rate. So we're letting them know, hey, rates are turbulent right now. We agree to lock in our interest rate within 5 days of the final acceptance of this purchase agreement, or we're gonna let it roll, we're gonna let it ride, we're gonna lock in our interest rate basically anytime or as it might be required by the lender. Now, the lender cares almost as much about this house as your buyers, because the lender is issuing a gigantic loan on the house, and the house will go back to the lender if the buyer defaults on their mortgage, if they stop making the payments. So the lender is going to want to make sure that the home is safe and habitable, that you're not overpaying for it. So one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to conduct an appraisal. An appraisal is different than the home inspection. The appraisal is done to make sure, like I said, the house is safe and habitable and of the value that you're buying it for. So if the appraiser goes in and says like, oh my gosh, there's like falling down sheetrock and there's no ventilation in this bathroom and there's no handrail to walk all the way down to the basement stairs, the lender may say, before I'm letting this buyer move in, all this work has to be done. Now, your buyer may eagerly say like, okay, no problem, I'll just pay for it or I'll go in and do it, but it's never in your best interest as a buyer to put money into something that you don't already own. So that's why this paragraph comes into play. We're telling the lenders that we are going to ask the seller to pay, and it's usually like $1,000, maybe $500 at a maximum to do any work that's a requirement of the buyer's mortgage company. Then once that work is done, the buyer's mortgage appraiser has to go back out to do a re-inspection to make sure that it looks the way they wanted it to look, and there's a fee for that. They don't do it for free. So either the seller is going to have to pay for that as a part of their closing costs, or the buyer is going to pay for it as a part of their closing costs. And it's most often the buyer who has to pay the re-inspection fee. And you just need to talk through this with them to make sure they understand it. You're gonna breeze through this on a house that's great condition or new construction, but to an owl, you're gonna wanna talk a little bit more detailed about it. There are protections for consumers who are using loans that are backed by the federal government, and that's VA or FHA. So if, for some reason, a person is doing an FHA or a VA loan, and they say they're gonna buy it for $200,000, but it only appraises by the mortgage company's appraiser for $190,000, this is their out. They do not have to buy the house. They can cancel it. They can get their earnest money back on 100%. However, they can still buy the house. They would just have to bring that $10,000 difference to pay the seller for the difference. And there's also some fees that they have to pay, that a seller might have to pay for a veteran to thank them for their service. So these couple things you're gonna wanna talk in detail with, lines 140 through 147. You're gonna wanna talk in detail with the mortgage company about that before you fill it in. So I can't really tell you how to fill it in, except that it is most common to have the funding fee paid for by the buyer as a part of their closing costs. All right. It is a possibility, especially for those people buying their first home, that they'll have saved up a bunch of money for their down payment, but they won't have saved up enough money to also pay their closing costs. And closing costs tend to be 3% of the sales price of the home. So as a convenience, so to speak, to the buyers, you may ask the seller to pay your closing costs. So to make it even, to keep it net, you would say to the seller of this $200,000 house, okay, we're gonna buy your house for $206,000, of which you're getting $200,000, and we want $6,000 to be paid as to the title company as part of our closing costs. Or if you're in a position where you can negotiate with them, you'll say, we're just still buying a house for $200,000. We want you to pay $6,000 of our closing costs, and that means you essentially are getting $194,000 for the house. So you can use a dollar amount there, or if it's better, you can use a sliding scale, and you can say that it's going to be 3% of the sales price. We also want to strongly encourage our buyers to conduct home inspections. I went over that. What's the difference between the home inspection and the home appraisal? That's very good education, and for someone who declines a home inspection, I'd like you to use that form most definitely. If someone is electing to do a home inspection, it's probably not as important to have them sign that, but you're letting the seller know here that it is the buyer's intention to either conduct or not conduct an inspection. They can actually conduct a home inspection, but not make the purchase contingent upon the finding of the home inspection. That would be like for informational purposes only, and that's kind of a midway that I'm happy to see people doing. And then we tell the seller that either they do or they do not allow us to conduct any intrusive testing as a part of our home inspection. Most cases you're going to say does not, but if this happens to be like a really old house, and let's just say it's on acreage, and you actually want to have someone come in and use a backhoe and dig the dirt from the outside of the foundation to see if it's been properly cared for on the outside, that would be an intrusive test. Let's say that there's a piece of the sheetrock that you want to cut out to be able to look at the plumbing or look up in the attic. That would be intrusive testing. So in most cases, they are not going to do it, but you need to tell them if you plan to. You also need to tell them within how many calendar days, not business days, but calendar days of the date of final acceptance that all of your tests and inspections are going to be done. And it's really important that you know and resulting negotiations. Because people are trying, if they're gonna do a home inspection, they're trying to do it really fast. Like some of them I audit, I see, this inspection is gonna be done within 3 days. Well, that's fine, except you're probably negotiating this at 8 p.m. Final acceptance maybe won't even come through until, 11 p.m. So now you've only got 3 days to reach out to a home inspector, see if they're available, try to get them to the house. The home inspectors usually spend about 3 or 4 hours there. Then they take all their photos and all their findings, and a lot of them do their paperwork at night. So the home inspection report doesn't even come to your buyer until oftentimes the next morning. Then that buyer may say like, oh God, I need to get an estimate on new gutters, or I need to get an estimate on new windows or something like that. It may take a couple of days for us to get those. Then you have to put it on paper, what you ask of the seller as a result of the home inspection. So a more realistic time frame is within 10 calendar days. Again, if there are other inspection items, just referencing that, I said maybe your buyer has a high allergy to mold, and in every offer you're making, you want to make sure and word it the same way. This is a good spot where you can start adding in some personalized clauses here. Now, it's not happening very often anymore because it's not seen as the strongest, best offer, but the buyer also has the right to choose if they would like to make the purchase of their new home contingent upon the sale of their current home. So if they are, they would check box 1 here, and you would include a separate addendum with more details on it. If they're not contingent upon the sale of a home, they would check box 3. And there is a possibility, especially with like some relocation people I found, that they may have sold their house in Florida already. They have a closing date on their house in Florida. Now that that's wrapped up, they're flying up here to Minnesota to look at houses. So they may be contingent upon the successful closing of their property, which is located here, which is scheduled to close on this date, but it doesn't need to be listed and still sold, which would be number 1. This is when it's already sold, all contingencies are removed, it's already in a contract. Real estate taxes are often split between buyer and seller on the date of closing in a prorated fashion. So what that means is everything from January 1st until the date of closing is paid for by the seller. Everything from the day of closing until the end of the year is then paid for by the buyer. So you would check here saying that these property taxes are going to be prorated. However, if you want to sweeten your deal, you could tell the seller, hey, I'm willing to pay you all your taxes from the whole year. Like, I know you've already probably paid them in to your mortgage company or to the county, but I'll make up the difference. So I'll give you more money at closing to pay all of your taxes. Or maybe you say, hey, I want you to pay all the taxes for the whole year. I see here on the county records that you've already mailed your check in. I don't want to have any taxes. Or maybe it's per month. So those options exist for who knows what kinds of reasons. But most often, your buyer is going to request that the seller prorate taxes. Don't miss this. When I'm auditing, I see this a lot. If the property tax status is part of a non-homestead classification, the seller either shall or shall not pay the difference between the homestead and non-homestead value. So what that means is There are a lot of properties that are owned by estates. Maybe they're owned by, it's an investor, this is their rental property, or maybe it's their vacation property. And in the state of Minnesota, their owners are allowed to have one homestead tax credit exemption, and then their property taxes are lower. So if you know someone who has a cabin, or you have a cabin, your cabin's property taxes are going to be non-homesteaded because you don't live there as your homestead, and those are a little bit higher. The state of Minnesota has done this to incentivize people to be homeowners. And then to not penalize, but to just also kind of keep it more fair and say, if you can afford to have multiple properties, your property taxes are going to be a little bit higher on that non-homestead property. However, when the new buyer closes on it, on a non-homestead property, their taxes will be adjusted down to the non-homestead status. So you have the ability to ask on behalf of your buyer if the seller will agree to pay a portion of that, because knowing their taxes are higher. I'm spending more time on this than you're really gonna spend with anyone, except for maybe an owl who's maybe buying something that was formerly a rental property. So just keep me in the back of your mind, but don't miss this form. The check mark gets missed a lot, or don't miss this line, the check box gets missed a lot. You're also going to want to clear up how you'll handle any deferred taxes or any special assessments that the seller perhaps has not paid. So in the tax section of an MLS listing here, you're going to want to look at this on the right-hand column, and it's going to say this is the tax year, this is the tax amount, this might be an assessment that is outstanding, so like she maybe hasn't paid her water bill in a couple months, and is there a pending assessment? So it looks like maybe they're doing some street improvements, or maybe they're fixing the sidewalks or adding something new in here. So we're saying, yes, there is actually an assessment. So when you do your form, you're going to want to say that the seller is going to pay all of that, or perhaps to sweeten the deal, you're going to say that the buyer shall assume it. Cool. We're also going to note in here that, to our knowledge, based on the listing and perhaps based on the disclosure form, that the seller has or has not received a notice of any new improvement projects. There's also a possibility that you, writing this purchase agreement, have written a purchase agreement for your client on another house. They decided not to buy it based on the finding of their home inspection. You sent over a cancellation to that seller, but that seller hasn't gotten it back to you yet. But your buyer doesn't want to miss out on this one because this was so perfect, even more perfect than the last one. So you need to disclose to the person you're making the offer at that this purchase agreement is indeed subject to the cancellation of a previously written purchase agreement, which was dated, whatever the contract date was, and that you expect that cancellation back on whatever date you expected. Likewise, when looking at the agent remarks, there's a possibility that the listing agent may have said to you, hey, we did have another offer, it fell through, please make sure that your purchase agreement is written subject to the cancellation of the prior written contract. So this applies to both contracts that the seller has written or accepted and the buyer has written as well. When buying and selling a car, you get a title to the car, and when buying and selling a piece of real estate, you get a deed to the property. So most often you are going to check here that it is a warranty deed. However, if it happens to be a property that is owned by like the estate of someone who passed away, or maybe it's an investment property, you would then receive a personal representative's deed or a trustee's deed, and you would likely see that again in the agent remarks or talking with the realtor. There's a possibility you might also be getting a contract for deed, which means you don't get the whole bundle. If you remember that, you don't get the full bundle of rights, and we'll talk about contract for deed here in a little bit. So something that I think is a really hidden gem that not enough buyers and buyers agents utilize is the day of closing is incredibly stressful for everyone, but it is the most stressful for a seller. I mean, they are packing up everything, they're trying to clean it, they're trying to say goodbye to their neighbors, it's just really stressful. So most people say, hey, if I'm buying this house and I'm signing on the dotted line and I'm turning over my $30,000, like I want to be able to move in immediately after closing. And that makes perfect sense. You've placed insurance on the house, everything's ready. Most often people are going to want to close or move in, get possession immediately after closing. But to be kind, your buyer may say to the seller, hey, I know it's a busy day. I'll just move in 12 hours after closing. So if our closing is at 10 a.m., as long as you get me the keys by 10 p.m., it's totally fine. Other people may say 48 hours, 24 hours, 1 week after closing. If it goes any longer than like 5 days, I do recommend that you write, it's a small release that I think we'll have in here as well, saying that now those former owners have become your tenants, essentially. But it is a really nice thing to do for sellers on such a stressful day. So just kind of be thinking about that. All right, we've got like 2 pages here of a lot of just kind of definitions and explanations. So I'm gonna run through them pretty quickly, but before I do, any questions so far?
Have you ever had it happen where you give them the 12 hours after closing and like something happens to the house?
That's the risk. I haven't had it happen, knock on wood, but it should happen. There could be a tornado, there could be a fire, there could be a water faucet left on, there could be a mover who knocks a big hole in the wall. In all those cases, you just hope that you're working with good and moral humans who say like, I recognize I made this mistake and I'll make it right. But they wouldn't have to, the seller wouldn't have to. So the seller agrees to the buyer that they will discontinue services on things that are controlled wirelessly at the property. So that would be like their Wi-Fi and their Ring doorbell and stuff. If there are any association dues, city water bills, utilities and such, all of those will be prorated. Like I referenced, the property taxes are often prorated. As quickly as possible after the final acceptance of this purchase agreement, the buyer shall start working with their mortgage company and their title company to prepare for closing, and that the seller will begin to do an abstract to provide clear title to the property. If there happens to be a large amount of land that then can be subdivided, this article references that. If the seller did any work on the property where they hired a contractor but they didn't pay the contractor can file a lien on the property. So here the seller is saying that they will make all payments for everything in full. If the seller receives any notices from a governmental authority from the time that you execute the contract until closing, they'll pass those on. The buyer acknowledges that any dimensions and square footage and even the size of the lot are approximates, and that it is the sole responsibility of the buyer to verify those measurements on their own to satisfy their accuracy of it. It lets the seller know that they do have to allow reasonable access to the property for any performance that the buyer needs, so like home inspections and appraisers and whatnot. It talks about if there's a natural disaster, so if there's a fire or vandalism, if there's a flood, that it is the sole responsibility of the seller to bring the property back up to its condition it was when the offer was made and accepted. And so that risk of loss falls entirely on the seller until the time of closing. Time is of the essence, meaning you need to work quickly in presenting these offers and responding to them. Gives definitions of how we calculate days and what the difference is between business days and calendar days. It talks about how the earnest money would be refunded should the buyer and seller agree to cancel and exchange any earnest money. And it also goes on to talk about what would happen if the buyer becomes in default. So if they don't meet all of the deadlines that are written here in the purchase agreement. Again, it talks about that notice regarding predatory offenders. It comes up in a few places, so it's really important you go through it with that very first form. Then it talks, like we did on the Keller Williams general disclosure, that they have the right to walk through the property prior to closing to make sure that it's in substantially the same condition as the date of the contract. And the buyer either acknowledges that they do have a copy of the property's disclosure statement, or at least a seller's disclosure alternative form. If neither of those are available by the time you're making an offer from the listing realtor, you would go down here into the other section and you would say that this purchase is contingent upon the seller providing and the buyer reviewing the property disclosure, because it's really, really important to have that record when representing the buyer. All right. It also says here that the buyer has received inspection reports if they are required by a municipality. There's like roughly a dozen cities within the Twin Cities that require someone from the city come out and conduct a housing. It's oftentimes called Truth in Housing report. So buyer is then also acknowledging that they've received that report if they haven't. In the other section, it's important that you know that there. If the property happens to have a well or a septic system, there are separate disclosures for those. So most often you're going to say that you are connected to city water and sewer and that therefore these things do not apply. But if for some reason there's a well and septic, you would check no here. You would say that the seller does know of it and the seller does know of a septic and does know of a well, and therefore that this purchase agreement is subject to an addendum to the purchase agreement regarding the septic and well inspection. We talked about home warranties in that Qwpr general disclosure. So I try to mix things up. I mean, we've gone through a lot of articles here. We've gone through a lot of things here. And I will oftentimes turn to the buyers and I'll be like, when's the last time you bought a TV? And they'll be like, what? Out of nowhere. And I'm like trying to get their brain a little, to decompress. And they'll be like, oh yeah, we found one like a super good deal at Best Buy last year on Black Friday, and so we bought it then. And then I'll say, did you get the home warranty with it? And they'll be like, no, we think those are a total crock. Or the owls will say like, oh, absolutely, I buy a warranty on everything that I buy. So then I'll say, well, had you ever thought about getting a warranty on your home? And people will say like, oh no, those are worthless. No, thank you. And then very simply you say there's no home protection plan. Or they'll say, it's maybe not a bad idea, that water heater and that air conditioner are pretty old, like tell me more about it. And I would say then, it's a multiple offer situation, it's very likely the seller is not going to agree to pay for the home warranty for us, but we can let them know that you do intend to look into getting a home warranty and that you would pay for it all on your own here. I have some great companies that you can look into and you can choose it. And if it is paid for by the seller or selected by the seller, you need to write in the name of the warranty company, you need to write in an approximate amount, and those are usually like between $500 and $750. So then we go back to the important stuff and we say, all right, well, we talked about dual agency before, but fortunately this is not a dual agency situation because John Hockey-Meister, spelled differently, is with Edina Realty, so he's representing just the seller, I'm representing you as just the buyer. There's a possibility if John Hoffmeister was actually with Keller Williams, Deferred Realty, that we both are dual agencies here, and then you need to go to the next spot and say that dual agency does indeed apply into this transaction, and they sign here as the buyer, and then the sellers will come back and sign it as well. We go on to talk about that foreign investment and real estate act again. If the seller was a foreign individual, they would let us know on their property disclosure, so we had a heads up on that. We let them know that there may be some additional closing costs that they have to pay at closing, which we talked about already as a part of the buyer rep agreement. And we also are going to remind them that they're going to receive a preliminary settlement statement from their title company, and they have the right to review that a few days before closing. We're also, again, letting them know that this, to be binding, has to be executed by both parties and copies must be delivered to both. Electronic signatures are just as valid. This entire agreement is the agreement. We don't have any side agreements or anything that's verbal, not in writing. And we also have to let them know that any warranties specified in this purchase agreement can survive the delivery of the deed or contract for deed. So if a person passes away, they still have the deed to the property as a part of their estate. All right, there's other terms that you can write in here if you wish. There's other addenda that we're going to go over in the last 15 minutes, and you would check them if they're included here. And your buyer is going to sign over here on the right-hand side. You're going to sign and print their name. Then you, as a really good buyer's realtor, are going to look to make sure that when the seller has signed it, that the seller is the one who has checked either they are or they are not a foreign person. And the cutest example of this that another fellow broker gave to me that just reminds me how important it is that you don't check it as a buyer. Even if you see it, even if it's verbalized to you, even if it's on their disclosure, he said, hey, have you ever gone to a bar and someone's told you that they're single? Like, yeah. He said, well, how do you really know they're single? I'm like, oh, okay, valid point. So we don't want to say, oh yeah, they told us that the seller was not a foreign individual because they just told me they were single. We want the seller to be the one to verify on this contract that we can go back and truly know with accuracy that they are or are not afforded individually. So once the seller accepts it, or if the seller has countered it, the seller will put a check mark here on line 41 saying like, oh, there's a couple things that we want to change in the terms of this contract. They'll then check up there and say it's subject to a counteroffer. They'll sign down here, and it doesn't get dated until everyone has come to a final agreement. And this final acceptance date is really important because that's what starts the days ticking for things like their home inspection. Next one that we're going to talk about is the arbitration agreement. So before I even have my buyer sign here or sign arbitration, I just go to a completely different form and then I bring them back. The wire fraud is also always on the purchase agreement. If you haven't signed it once before, they don't have to do it again. Okay, so arbitration. Arbitration was designed by the Board of Realtors to be an alternate to hiring attorneys and going to court. So arbitration is fully elective. They can decline arbitration and it doesn't impact their purchase whatsoever. In the interest of time, I'm going to have you guys read through it in detail. It gives some details about when they can file it, or when they can file it and how they file it, if they might be better off doing small claims court, so on and so forth. But what I say when I'm going through this form is I say, hey, you know, we really hope once you moved into this house that it's in an excellent condition and that the seller has taken care of it and that they've been very honest and ethical with you about the condition of the home. But once you've moved in, if you found that there's some things that aren't in good working order and you're very frustrated, you can file an arbitration claim. I can't be a part of it because my agency relationship with you ends on the day of closing, but I can get you copies of all the paperwork that you need, and you of course can also consult with legal advice and consult with a lawyer. My brokerage, Keller Williams Preferred Realty, encourages me to sign an agreement of arbitration because they feel it's fast, efficient, and affordable way of handling disputes that arise post-closing. But like I said, this is not going to be binding whether you sign it or not. It also isn't binding if the sellers happen to decline it. So just because you might want to agree to it doesn't mean that everyone will end up agreeing to arbitration. But here's a scenario that I often give. Let's just say you move in, it's winter. And then in the spring, you start to notice that all the snow is melting off your roof and some water is coming in one of the seams of the ceiling. You may say like, oh my gosh, this wasn't a defect that our inspector could have found because this is now a change of seasons, and we believe very strongly that the seller knew of this and they covered it up and they intentionally listed their house in the winter for that reason. We are mad. We are either going to take him to court or we're going to take him to arbitration. Well, if you take him through arbitration, a non-biased arbitrator comes right to the property. They come to the house, they would bring a roofer, they would likely bring me, they would likely bring the seller's realtor. Of course, the seller would be present as well. They look at it physically, they talk through it, there's information that's shared and verbalized there on site, and they rule on it either right there or just a couple days after. As a comparison, if you don't agree to arbitration, you would need to interview attorneys, you would need to select an attorney, you would need to pay a gigantic retainer fee to an attorney, who then files a claim in court, who then assigns a court date, who then sits in front of a judge who maybe knows something about construction and housing or maybe doesn't, and then that's ruled upon there. So as you can see, arbitration was designed to be quicker, more efficient, and more affordable. But you need to decide, and it's a big decision, you need to decide ahead of time if you would agree to arbitration or not. So I'm not going to have you sign this arbitration form right now. I just wanted you to know that it exists because as a part of the purchase agreement, you have to sign here acknowledging that I reviewed the option of arbitration with you. So then people will say like, oh yeah, good, okay, yeah, I don't know what I want to do here, but I am cool with signing down here, which says I acknowledge that I've received and had the opportunity to review the disclosure statement arbitration, which is voluntary from this purchase agreement. So they'll sign there and they'll say, okay, perfect. Now we're also ready to sign your actual offer. So please sign up here above where I printed your names. I'm just going to set this arbitration form over here to the side, and you guys can sign it at the very end after you've had the chance to think about it a little bit longer. So that's arbitration. Now, if they happen to live in a community that has an association fee, again, read this form, it's super lengthy, it's legitimately 3 pages, but the gist of it is that they understand that they're buying into a community that has probably some very strict rules and regulations and monthly association fees that goes along with it. So once the seller has provided to them all of those association documents. They can take them and hold them for 10 days and review them. They also have the option to reduce it down from 10 days to a shortened number of days if they wish, but the smallest amount of days that they have to do that is 3 days, and they have to sign this modification actually if they wish to reduce it down to 3 days. Now, for everyone's best interest, especially when it's closing within that 45 days or even sooner, we're gonna want them to reduce that or to waive what's left of the 10-day right of rescission. So don't skip this form just because you're working quickly. Pull this out and make sure and waive that 10-day right of rescission. And then it does ask some questions on here about do they, is this applicable? Do they want to waive it? Do they want to shorten it? So by the time you're getting to this point, even the owls are going to be like, I don't think I necessarily need you to read every single paragraph, which is why I tend to scan through them a little bit faster. You can go into the dashboard though and listen to me talk about it in full length if you want to rehearse that for yourself. Now, I mentioned there's a possibility that your buyer may have to sell their home before they can buy the new home. And if so, you use this very simple one-page addendum. It puts the date on it. It references what date you wrote the offer on the other home. It references the offer on the other home. And then it says this purchase agreement is contingent upon the buyer entering into a valid purchase agreement for the sale of their current property located at. Now, if it's in Florida and you don't have it listed, you would say it will be listed within, call it 10 days, 15 days, 30 days, I think it's kind of on the high end, but it'll be listed with, Atlantic Coast Realty of, Naples or whatever. Or maybe it's already listed with you. Ideally, that would be the case, that you're gonna get this backup listing, but you'll make it clear to the seller here, whatever the case may be. And then you're also saying to the seller, hey, you're agreeing to sell this to me, even though this is a little bit risky, knowing I need to sell my current home. So if someone else comes to you before I sold my house and says, hey, I'm not contingent, I'm gonna buy it, the seller then can demand the removal of this contingency by sending you some sort of removal of contingency or cancellation. And you can also remove your contingency by then providing a fully executed purchase agreement on the sale of this backup home that you listed within a certain number of days here. And I just write within 3 days is kind of my standard, but I don't think it needs to be longer. So it talks about how the closing will take place and if there is a failure to remove the contingency and how the earnest money shall be allocated if so. If the property has a well or a septic system, I think that's what's coming up next, right? Do you guys have, I bet you have the addendum and the amendment and then the addendum to purchase agreement counteroffer? Is that what you have?
Yeah.
I'm not gonna open those in the interest of time here, but those are just one-page worksheets where you would add additional information. Just remember, when you're making an offer, you can add additional information, but after the offer has been made and you might need to change some of the terms of the contract, then you are amending the contract, then you're changing it, not just adding to it. So that's the difference between the amendment and the addendum. When you make an offer, if a seller counters back on some of your terms, they would use this form here called the addendum to purchase agreement counteroffer. Some of the most standard ways that a purchase agreement is countered are written in here. There's also an other section where they can write other things in. So maybe they want a different closing date. Maybe they want you to put more money down. Maybe they want you to put more earnest money down. Maybe they want to change the contract sales price. Now, if they're countering you and they say, hey, I actually want you to increase the price to $210,000, it'll come back to you with the seller's signature on this side over here. You can either execute it by signing it and saying, yep, we agree to that, and we put in the final date of acceptance, or you say, hey, no, that is way too greedy. I agree to buy your house for $207,000. I'm not going to increase my earnest money to $5,000, but I will agree to increase it to $3,000. And I want to keep my closing date the same. So you're going to take all of this out. You then would sign it and send it back to the seller. And in this negotiation, some realtors do it verbally. I think that's a really poor idea. So I want you to do all of your negotiating on this counteroffer agenda. Make sense? Cool. All right, so if the person buying the house now, do you have buyers move in and sellers rent back, or do you have well and septic addendums?
I have both, but buyers moving in the rent.
Okay, perfect. So it's possible that your buyer may want to move into the house before they've actually closed on it. So if you're making an offer on a vacant property and you've got someone who's, living at home with their parents, or maybe they're moving from out of town and they're waiting for that house to close, this essentially serves as a little lease, and it's just 2 pages long. And it just outlines some things like, this is who's gonna pay the insurance, this is gonna be the fee. I strongly encourage you in both of these instances that I'll be describing that you do wanna collect a security deposit, or you want to give a security deposit, because that will cover the insurance deductible should something unfortunately go awry. So you'll see it in both instances here. Either the buyers will move in, or the buyers may have already closed and they're allowing the sellers to stay there for longer than that, 5-day period. And again, it's just a 2-page document. It's just a little mini lease. We have or will be a part of leases, so you'll see a bunch of them. But this is a very simplistic one that can be used to try to make things work between buyers and sellers if they want to try to overlap in the property a little bit. Okay, now getting to what I'm thinking I was going to next. If you are helping someone buy a home that has a septic system, that means it's connected to not connected to city water and sewer, you need to use this addendum, and you need to say then that your buyer wants to be contingent upon a couple of things. You want the seller to have done a test and provided it to your buyer, which is called a septic system inspection report, which indicates that the system complies with all applicable city or township regulations at that time. Septic systems are like $20,000, even $30,000. So if you are helping a buyer who the seller says, yeah, my toilet totally flushes just fine, my septic system should be just fine, you are not representing them in their best interest. You have to do this inspection contingency. Likewise, if there's a well, you want to make sure that the seller obtains a water quality test of the water that's there. So that's the well inspection contingency. And next is the seller's property disclosure. So I want you to just get your eyes on what your buyers are going to be reviewing when it comes to understanding what the seller's history of the property is. So when you're in the listing, you'll see a little icon up here. You'll see a little icon up here that looks like a bunch of stack of papers. And you'll be able to click on that, and that takes you to the supplements. And so most listing realtors should put a properties disclosure on there. If they haven't, reach out to them individually and ask for them. For homework for yourself, as you're looking at properties on the North Star MLS, click on this and just review a handful of people's sellers' disclosures, because some of them will be really detailed, some of them will be really plain, but I don't want you to scan over this and not understand what these things are. So I'm not gonna go over it today, I'll go over it in the sellers bootcamp on Saturday, but I just want you to have at least gotten your eyes on what a seller's disclosure is. Okay. If for some reason, and I didn't go over this now, I'm realizing in hindsight, I didn't go over this on the agency relationships in real estate, but I should have. If for some reason you're representing someone as a facilitator, not as a representative, Keller Williams Preferred Realty allows you to do that for 2% rather than the higher market rate that we have for sellers. And so if a buyer and seller have put themselves together, so like if someone is buying their grandma's house, for example, you'd be able to use this facilitator services agreement, and the recording of it is on the dashboard. If someone is buying a house in a contract for deed, again, that's on the dashboard, but there's really, really important information on this form here, which says important information about contract for deed. It makes it clear, either you as the new owner do have to pay homeowners insurance and property taxes and do the repairs or not. Key things to think about before you agree to get into a contract for deed, and they are so rare, which is why I'm not gonna bog your brain down with it now. These are just forms that buyers need, but the ones that we're getting to in the back end here are far less common. Looks like I put one in here, when I was working on something else by accident. There's a seller hold harmless and also a buyer's hold harmless. I don't use these on all cases, but it's a good idea for you to read them and to consider them. We basically have a hold harmless in the buyer and seller representation agreements, but if you get into something really tricky where the buyer is like telling you strange things that they want to do, that they insist that they do, they don't want to conduct a home inspection, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have them sign this buyer hold harmless agreement. And it basically just says that we acknowledge that we will not hold our realtor and our real estate brokerage liable for anything that we agree to do on our own. Last but not least, should you have to sign a cancellation of a purchase agreement, that's what this looks like. The cancellation is very simplistic. It just says, this is what today's date is, this is the date of the original purchase agreement, and now we're talking about that earnest money, and we either are keeping it, the sellers are retaining it, or we're giving it back 100% to the buyers, or what happens most often is the buyers and sellers negotiate on something and say like, gosh, you know, we're just a week before closing, we'll give you back $1,000 of your earnest money, but we need to keep $2,000 for all the repairs that you insisted we make and whatnot. So you can write in some sort of agreement here. And then you put the buyer's name and street address here so that our market center can give it to the brokerage of the seller, and that company can just fill it out and mail it to them. That covers a lot, doesn't it? Any dying questions, any specific things that you want me to go back to?
Wait, so how long, when you just skim through all of this paperwork, when you're with the client, how long does it take you?
About a half hour.
And like, right, and like what,
Excellent question.
like which ones do you like have to speak on when you're with the client?
Yep. So I want you to go really in depth on agency relationships. I want you to go really in depth on the compensation disclosure to the buyer. I want you to go really in depth on the purchase agreement, and everything else you're probably gonna breeze through.
Okay.
So it's the agency relationships in real estate, compensation disclosure, and the purchase agreement.
Okay.
Cool. How lucky are you to have been able to sneak in on this today?
I know.
I'm gonna go back to the Zoom and see if Tyler has any questions. Tyler, are you still hanging in there? I haven't been watching. Oh, no, he must have had a sign up. Okay, well, thank you so much, you guys. for
That was
being here
awesome.
with us.
Yeah, that was really nice.
Good, and Saturday will be